Hello, everyone. Welcome. We will give everybody just a few moments to get into the room, make sure their audio is working before we get started here with our Women Lead webinar today. And I'll wait until the number levels off a little bit. Okay, so I think we will get started and people will just kind of join as they're able. But hello, everyone. My name is Toni Phelan. I am an MBA program manager here at Forte, and I'm pleased to welcome you to Forte's Women Lead webinar series. Today, we're partnering with the Wharton School, and our webinar is titled How to Negotiate Fearlessly. Before we get started, I'd like to share a little bit about Forte for those of you who may be new to the Women Lead series. So Forte has been around for almost 20 years. Our community of motivated and inspiring women, 100,000 women and counting, is changing the balance of power in the workplace. We open doors for women to reimagine what they can achieve in business, from launching their first jobs to advancing to the C-suite. Through business education, role models, professional networks, and leadership training, Forte shows women how to build the credibility, skills, network, and confidence to thrive as leaders and change the status quo. We are delighted to host today's event in partnership with the Wharton School, and I will now turn the session over to Kendra King, Associate Director of Admissions. She will share more about Wharton before introducing our featured speaker today. Kendra, please take it away.
Great. Thank you, Toni. And hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this fantastic Women Lead webinar with the Forte Foundation. As Toni mentioned, my name is Kendra King. I'm the Associate Director of Admissions for the Wharton MBA program for executives. And we're very proud to partner with the Forte Foundation to support women as they pursue their MBAs, no matter where they are in their career. For almost 50 years, we've been offering the Wharton MBA in this executive format for professionals who want to pursue their business education without putting their career on pause. Our program is 2 years. We have classes that run every other weekend on Fridays and Saturdays on our Wharton campuses in Philadelphia and in San Francisco as well. And what makes our executive MBA program really special is that it's the same exact degree as the full-time Wharton MBA. Same curriculum, same faculty. We even have the same number of in-classroom learning hours, over 700. And this is a really exciting year for us because we are launching an additional cohort. So this is a new way for people to earn the Wharton MBA, the global cohort. So some of you may have heard about this, some of you may have not. This is a brand new way to do this program. It's 75% virtual and 25% in person. It's a blended schedule. And the idea is to expand access to the Wharton MBA program for executives for folks who can't commute every other weekend to Philadelphia or San Francisco. And that's a lot of people around the globe. So we're thrilled to be able to expand this for women, no matter where they live, no matter where they are in their career. And we're really excited to contribute to an even more diverse alumni network, 104,000 and counting. And our alumni network is going to have an even stronger global presence moving forward. So we're really excited about that. We hope you are excited as well. And we're also thrilled to have one of our own, our Wharton alumna, here with us today to speak about the art of negotiation. Professor Mori Taheripour is an award-winning educator, highly sought-after speaker, and author of Bring Yourself: How to Harness the Power of Connection to Negotiate Fearlessly. She's worked with some of the most iconic sports brands and Fortune 100 corporations over the past 20 years. Top business publications and media outlets have featured Mori's work, ESPN, Forbes, Marketplace, Money, NPR. And Mori also teaches negotiation and dispute resolution at the Wharton School. She serves on the faculty of the Legal Studies and Business Ethics Department, and she's a 7-time recipient of awards for excellence in teaching. So I am thrilled to introduce to you all Professor Mori Taheripour. Mori, thank you for being with us today.
Hi, Kendra. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Great. And I think that the art of negotiation is something that is particularly salient for women. I know that, for myself, growing up, 10 years ago when I got my first job, and my dad told me, don't negotiate, just, you're happy to have a job. And I don't know that he would have told that to my older brothers. So this is something that I'm really interested in learning more about. And I thought we could kick it off with kind of asking what inspired you to write Bring Yourself.
So again, thank you. Thanks to the Forte Foundation for having me. This is in fact somehow become, especially over the pandemic, such an important topic for people because they find themselves negotiating every day, all day, which I thought was what we did before anyway, but it sort of put everything else in context, right? Negotiating at home, negotiating outside the home, negotiating whether they go back to work. So it's sort of ever present for people. But kind of, I'm going to take us back before the pandemic and sort of how I even got into teaching in the first place. And this isn't something I had ever imagined for myself. I was at Wharton actually and got asked to teach. This is many, many years ago, and didn't ever saw myself doing this. And once I got kind of talked into this by a former professor of mine, I realized that what he was telling me was exactly how I felt, which is I love negotiations, and not for the reason that a lot of people think. I'm not a very contentious person. I'm not argumentative, but I thought that it was always a really important way that I got to know myself better, right? A lot of the negotiations that we do is with ourselves, big decisions that we make at different junctures in our life. So what I wanted to do with this book was fill in some of the gaps that I thought existed out there around negotiations. And one of which is that I felt like a lot of the books and information that were out there was completely prescriptive. And I don't believe that's what negotiations is. It's not like baking a cake, right? Everybody is different. Everybody negotiates differently. And so I wanted to have an opportunity to sort of have this message for my readers that said anybody can be a great negotiator. And that's absolutely true, right? We have famous people that we know, they're great negotiators, like the Nelson Mandelas of the world, for example, that were everything but contentious, right? They led with empathy and understanding and respect. And then we go all the way to the other side. I do some work in sports. So we have these really contentious sort of sports agents, and they're equally successful. So what that tells us is that everything in the middle works. So it's a learned skill. You can get better, but you're not born with it, right? So it's something that we learn along the way. However, you sort of have to have the courage to lean in. And like you were saying, so this cultural bias, particularly with women, but in general, a lot of people are afraid of negotiations. They fear that it leads to conflict. A lot of people, because of that, sort of pull away from it and rather not, and they sit on the sidelines. And as we know, you miss a whole lot of things when you don't get into the conversation to begin with. So this book was to sort of change a lot of those myths that I think hold us back. And I wanted people to embrace it. I wanted this to be an opportunity for people to better understand themselves, to speak their voice and have the courage to do so, and know that they belong at any table, so long as they show up really sort of advocating for themselves and representing themselves courageously and unabashedly, and knowing that doesn't lead to conflict, that may actually create stronger relationships, that may allow us to better know people. So it's really to sort of change these myths, I think, that are out there, and make this a much more accessible and understandable approach to negotiations.
Absolutely. Yep. And I think the fear of conflict is a big one, especially for women in the workplace. You don't want to be seen as ruffling feathers sometimes, especially younger women, I think. So what are some of those other misconceptions about negotiations that you are dispelling in Bring Yourself?
And again, like we see this in society, we see this depicted in movies. We always see that really successful negotiator being the person that's in people's faces and being really aggressive, and that their dominant sort of personality is what leads them to success. And that's just not true. And I think that that's a really big myth that has to be dispelled, particularly for women. Because I think that women are actually exceptional negotiators, and studies show us that we're actually really great negotiators. It's just that where sort of goes sideways is when we negotiate on our own behalf. And again, there's so many cultural implications in there. But when we fear, and for women and men alike, I think these days, for anybody who considers themselves an other, this whole notion of how will I be seen? What will people think? and allowing ourselves to sort of move forward in our decision making based on the judgment that we think is out there, right? And how we're going to be perceived, that makes us actually not perform at our best. Whereas, and the whole time that, especially as women, I'll sort of focus this for a minute, given the audience. But, when we spend so much time worrying about what other people are going to think, there's far less time for us to spend strategizing. There's far less time spent on how we can focus on ourselves and, again, bring our best selves to the table. So because we're spending all that time in pretense, right? And even during the course of the conversation, we're almost there more than we are sort of exactly where our feet are, right? Exactly where we're present and being much more engaged in the conversation. And what that does is actually it takes away everything that makes women, I think, such great negotiators, right? We are at our best. We are connected. We respect relationships, and that's sort of a real primary goal for us to achieve in negotiations, right? Wanting sort of something for you, something for me. We're both walking away feeling fairly happy about the outcome, and that sort of win-win approach for women, I think, is brilliant, to be honest with you, because most negotiations are not one-time negotiations. They're relationships in perpetuity that are created. And we're more ethical. These are huge generalizations, but really, again, going with the studies that are out there, and our sense of empathy, which is truly our superpower, is something that is incredibly valuable in negotiations. So all the myths that tell us to be everything that we're not is actually robbing us of the opportunity to be the best that we are, and really performing that in a way that I think makes us tremendous negotiators. So it's really sort of looking inward and understanding what those things are, and sort of leaning hard into those things and knowing that's not going to work against us, but really for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this really resonates with me, of everything you're saying. And I'm sure our audience is feeling the same way. I'm kind of thinking about how we negotiate in our everyday lives, not just at work, but also at home, with family, with friends. And there's a lot of times that we need to be thinking about these things. So what would you say are some of the most crucial things to consider when you are preparing for a negotiation?
Yeah, so a lot of, probably the audience here, we've all learned, I think, along the way what things are important in preparation, and not just for negotiations, but anything. This could be sort of athletic training. It could be preparation for exams and preparation for a job interview. The same thing sort of holds with negotiations, right? Your goal setting. What is it that you want to accomplish? What is it that you want to get out of this conversation? Being perfectly clear about it. In fact, being really specific so that this is something that you can truly focus on, making a commitment to it, right? That sort of aspirational goal is really important, but then understanding it very specifically so that you can sort of put all your energy and might behind it, but also creating a sense of commitment and accountability for it, right? So writing those things down, telling somebody that, I'm going to go into this job interview and I'm going to come back out. This is the job I'm going to get. This is the package I'm going to get. So that sort of allows us to feel more accountable to what you're going to accomplish, right? And allowing us to sort of not back down very easily from it, because you're coming back and sort of reporting in, right? So that's really important. But the one thing that I think is left out with respect to preparation, and I'll get back to the sort of more general and traditional things that we're told about preparation. The one thing that I think is unfortunately left out a lot in this process is what I think is actually the very first part of preparation. I'm sorry. And that's to really just spend some time thinking about who you are. Like, even if it's just a few minutes. And by that, I mean, there are things about us that are so a part of us that's like part of our DNA, right? They're foundational to us. And those things are things like our ethics and our values, right? The things that we hold so true, our convictions, that if you don't sort of remind yourself of those things, it's very easy to get into negotiations. And should it be conflict ridden, should it get a little heated, we start making concessions. And yet those things that I just mentioned, our ethics, our values, our convictions, those are our non-negotiables, right? So to remind ourselves of that, to sort of, for those people that practice yoga here, it's like setting an intention for yourself, right? And what you are going to honor no matter what happens in this process. Because if you come out of a negotiations and let's say you didn't perform as well, sort of tangibly, right? What you're not going to regret is having made concessions around those things that are so much a part of you. Whereas if you do that, it doesn't matter how great the outcome is, right? When you look at the mirror afterwards, you're thinking, what did I do? Like, those are the things that are so important to me. This is the problem with us creating boundaries. This is the problem with us getting burnt out, because the very things that we should honor, we sort of forget. So I think that's sort of the first part of preparation that people often overlook, because they're like, of course I know who I am.
Right.
But it's really easy to sort of, especially for those of us who are pleasers, for us to sort of give in a little bit, sort of, well, yeah, that's a boundary, but let me change that a little bit for this person. I really care about them. And then slowly over time, you've given up so much of yourself that it's nothing, none of these conversations are even worth having anymore, because you've sort of given in all the time. And so I think that's a really important part of preparation, again, that we're not often told. And of course, the traditional, who's the person sitting across from you? What do you need to know about them? Being incredibly curious about them, and then carrying that curiosity into the actual negotiations, and being just so present and in the moment that you feel that sort of connection and can continue to learn about them.
Absolutely. And I think that when we do think about, who are we and what is our story, sometimes I think women still can sell themselves short when we are kind of presenting ourselves in these situations. How can we sort of adjust that narrative and reflect a position of value in these conversations?
Kendra, that is so important. And I actually think without being able to do that, I don't think anybody can actually negotiate successfully on their own behalf.
Mm-hmm.
And I honestly think, and this is sort of the approach that I took in my book, was to say, it's not because you're not intelligent enough, right? It's not because you don't have the IQ. It's not because you don't have the background or the wherewithal or the skills. When we don't do well in negotiations or continue to think we're not great negotiators, it's largely because we don't know how to get out of our own way. Right. And it's sort of the baggage that we carry, right? It's the cultural norms that we feel like we have to follow. It's the fear of judgment. It's things like imposter syndrome, right? And people don't really understand the connection. And I feel like it is so inherently important that until you're sort of able to do that emotional hygiene, and really understand, to your point, your value and how to not only communicate that to people, but really embrace it fully yourself, right? And again, a lot of people say my class is like therapy, and it's largely because I don't think I can teach you. It's very easy to teach tactics and strategy.
Mm-hmm.
It's very hard to tell people that this is the moment for you to stop and look inward, because quite honestly, that's where your power is going to come from. That's also where the challenges come from. And until you sort of clean that up, and until you really understand why you're so valuable, why you belong at every table, why it is your right and in every way you deserve to be a part of these conversations, then nothing I teach is of value, I think, because that's sort of the core part of this whole process. And to just make a really clear connection for people, when we don't know our value, when we don't understand not only what it is, but how to communicate it, by the way, both to ourselves and other people, then when we go to negotiations, because in our preparation, we sort of decided what our goals are and what we want to accomplish. Well, our goals aren't quite aspirational because we haven't really given ourselves the opportunity to want that much for ourselves, right? We don't think we deserve those things. We don't think we're worthy of those things. And so if you don't ask, then you're not going to get. And that's sort of the direct line between all of these things. So for those people that are here, you're perfectly competent in the sort of the qualifications to be a good negotiator. It's all the other work that we have to do that unfortunately is much harder, but so necessary.
Sure. Yeah. And thinking back to earlier in our conversation, you had mentioned, pleasers, and a lot of times women are people pleasers. We say yes to everyone and everything because it's sort of how we were taught to be. What do you think makes people who are people pleasers, what drives them to be so accommodating, and why do they find themselves, sometimes feeling resentful maybe towards others when it's, their internal drive that's telling them to say yes, yes, yes?
Yeah, interestingly, you said women, but it turned out to be that this was the most popular chapter in my book. And, man, woman, undergraduate student, executive, everybody sort of the feedback is, oh my God, I'm this person and I didn't even know it. And part of the whole notion of being a pleaser is that, first of all, let's talk about the good stuff. Pleasers are highly empathetic, right? They're very engaged in these conversations and these negotiations. They're perfectly present because part of what is sort of, again, at their core, they want to make sure that the other side is happy, right? So we spend time listening better and we spend time in order to service that person. We are far more engaged in that dialogue, which is really, really important. We ask questions and we're curious. The problem is that pleasers inherently think that if they then advocate on their own behalf, that necessarily means that they can't take care of the other person, or they can't ensure that the other person will walk away happy as well. And that's sort of the mindset behind people who think negotiations is conflict ridden, or there's room for only one, right? That sort of win-lose proposition. And that is so wrong, because honestly, the problem is that when pleasers continue to feel that way and in service to others undermine themselves, then over time, this again leads to burnout. You said the word, this leads to resentment in relationships. This leads to divorces because you just keep giving and giving and giving and giving. You haven't created that space for yourself. You haven't honored yourself. And so, it's sort of that oxygen mask example when you get on the plane, right? If you don't put on your own mask, you can't do that for somebody else. And you can't take care of somebody else. When we are empty, right? When we are replete of energy and opportunity and we're not happy, we can't do as much for people that we care about. And so it's sort of this reverse psychology, right? The whole notion is you're trying to do that just to please others. And oh, by the way, guess what you're actually doing? There's less of you to do for others. So changing that notion for pleasers and really allowing them to understand that, no, there is room for more than one. And just because you're taking care of yourself first or advocating for yourself first doesn't mean you're not leaving room for others. In fact, you're actually creating more space for them because you have more to give.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. That's something that, I think we can walk away from this session really taking to heart and bringing that to our next conversation when we're negotiating. And something else that I wanted to touch on, I know that Bring Yourself mentioned or talks about mindfulness and presence as really being essential to effective bargaining. Earlier you mentioned yoga and kind of setting an intention. Could you talk to us about sort of how the pandemic has affected our skills with negotiating? And it seems like we're kind of always on now with Zoom and all these other things. How can we successfully negotiate in today's world where we're always dialed in?
Well, a part of the issue and why mindfulness is so important, this problem existed far before the pandemic, right? Our distractibility is our level of distractibility is insane, right? If somewhere our attention span was proven to be somewhere around 8 seconds, and this is 2016, right? Mm-hmm. Down from a 20-second mark in 2000, right? So this precipitous drop. And so now, one pandemic later, I'm thinking we'd be lucky if we're not in the negative, right? We have all these negative thoughts every day, somewhere between 12,000 and 60,000 thoughts a day people have, and 80% of those are negative, right? So, I could keep running down these numbers for you, and everything tells us that our attention span may be our biggest asset, and yet it's dwindling. Okay. And so you have to sort of really focus on it, practice this notion of mindfulness, be very intentional about putting your phones away and eliminating distractions. And so I think what the pandemic did is that if you were sort of struggling with that before, now it's like tenfold, right? Because, as we've all seen, you've been in a Zoom call, all of a sudden a baby comes into the picture, right? The dog jumps over their head, right? Somebody opens the door and starts talking. We've seen funny commercials around this. And so the notion of you were distracted before, now you've got all of that around you because you don't have an office where you can close the door and nobody's really coming in, right? So yet another barrier that we had to sort of address. But the really interesting thing is that if you were able to sort of create those boundaries, right? And if you were allowed yourself to be better able to communicate that to other people around you and created sort of this moment of, with great intention of quiet and being really present, then what we found is, when I teach, for example, I'm so focused on the people sitting in front of me, their pictures on this computer screen, that it almost feels like it was far more intimate than it ever was in person in some ways, right? We're this close, and we're seeing people's backgrounds in a way that we would never see in a classroom or would never see in an office, right? They let us into their lives. And so there's something really profound about that. It's such a great privilege to be able to do that. So what I tell people is, one, you're already distracted. And two, now you have this opportunity, which could actually make or break you, right? Because if you continue to be that distracted, you can't be here. But if you take advantage of it, and if you really start with a great intention, being really focused and be where your feet are, right? Be exactly where you are in that moment, then all of a sudden we're like, hey, Zoom may actually help this negotiations, right? Zoom may allow me to better know this person in a way I never would have had the opportunity to know them before. So I think, we get really caught up in all the negative things that happened. But I think if you really sort of allowed yourself to get the best of this environment, of this sort of the contextualizing in a real sort of technological sort of backdrop that we didn't necessarily use to communicate before, there's actually a great upside to it. And I think that's why, when people are going back to work now, we're going to see more of this sort of hybrid environment, because there is an upside to it. So yeah, I think I often wondered, will this book continue to be relevant? Because, I tell my students they can't have technology in the classroom. I'm so adamant about that. And somehow I found after 3 years that it's even more important in that way. Like, you lean in even harder into those things and see the benefit of it.
Sure. Yeah, it's kind of crazy how quickly things are changing and evolving. And I think the pandemic sort of accelerated a lot of things, especially in the business world. Now, I do see some questions coming in from the audience. I wanted to ask you one more question about your book, and then a couple questions about your time at Wharton, as you are an alumna and a faculty member as well. If there is one thing, just to kind of close out, what is one thing that we could do, myself and the other women on the line, women or men on the line, what's one thing that we could do today to kind of start to bring ourselves and negotiate fearlessly?
Again, I think looking inward, right? And really understanding that you don't have to be somebody else to be a better negotiator. And taking that conversation all the way back, because I myself sort of battle imposter syndrome, right? And it's some number like 75%, I think, of people are plagued, and I say that sort of not so lightly. We have to deal with imposter syndrome, right? But this is an issue that's sort of top of mind. And so for a lot of people who are here, that fear is speaking up because they think, what will people think of me? Then allow them to see the best of you and understand yourself better, so that you can come to these conversations not trying to be somebody that you're not, because you won't be fulfilled at the end of the day anyway. But understand what things you have to do, whether it's seeking therapy, whether it's just journaling, the things that are your accomplishments, why you deserve being at the table in the first place, right? If you're going in for a salary increase and you're having compensation conversations, start jotting down all the things that you've accomplished. So I'm almost saying, look in that mirror and understand that there's somebody of value staring right back at you, and then somebody whose accomplishments are there because of how hard you've worked for them, right? Really sort of turning the empathy that we give to other people back on ourselves, and being really curious about those things, because again, we'll be better in relationships, we'll be better mothers, daughters, we'll be better employees, supervisors, all of those things. But that's such a necessary step. So I think it's really important. Just create that space for yourself. And maybe some of us need to do it every day as a reminder. But I just don't feel like success comes in any other way. That's sort of the elementary step.
Sure. Yeah, looking inward, absolutely. I'm starting to understand why negotiations is one of our most popular courses in the MBA program. And I wish that I could, maybe I'll pop in and audit one of your courses sometime. And then I wanted to, kind of move backwards and talk about your MBA. We might have women on the line right now who are considering going back to get their MBA, maybe mid-career, or maybe some younger women. Can you tell us more about your process and why did you pursue your MBA at the time that you did, and the impact that it had on you?
Yeah, really quickly, I had applied, well, I was going to go get my MBA at so much earlier than I actually did, but then had the opportunity to launch my company and former company at that point. And so I decided that I was going to just put off school for a while, right? I thought this opportunity was too good to not take advantage of. But I told myself at that time that I was really intent on getting this degree. I really, really wanted to go back to school. I thought it would be really helpful. And it became increasingly helpful as I sort of ran my company because, learning things the hard way, learning things, through challenges and mistakes, yeah, it makes an impression, but at some point you're like, I just want to be taught some of these things, right? And have sort of the lingo and the confidence even to be a part of these decisions. And so I applied to Wharton only for the executive MBA program, because in my mind, after all the research that I had done, it was the only program, and you said this earlier, and it's absolutely true, so true that I'll talk about that in a minute, but it was the only program that actually offered me the same MBA without sort of that asterisk next to it that said, this was different because it was an executive MBA. It wasn't a part-time MBA or whatever that was. And I didn't want that for myself. The programs are really expensive. I was self-sponsored. So I wanted sort of the best of the best. I was like, if I invest in myself in this way, I want it to be exactly what I had dreamed of getting, right? When I had first wanted to go to business school. Wharton was the only program in my mind that did that. Maybe by far the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. And there's been a lot of hard moments. If people read my book, they'll see that. But as far as the challenge of it, I am not going to lie. It was incredibly difficult, right? Because you have to balance all of these things. And I'm not one who thinks that you get perfect work-life balance. I learned very quickly that it's whatever is important at that moment, that's what you do. And everything else sort of takes a backseat. So you do that throughout the 2 years. But never have I felt more satisfied with a decision that I've made than when I finished the program. And I thought it was life-changing in more ways than I can even explain. My own story is sort of far more sort of detailed to get into, but the level of confidence that you feel after a program that is that challenging, that you somehow managed to do without time off and really sort of got through it. And then also you sit back and say, oh my God, how much have I learned, right? And the exceptional people that are in the classroom. I mean, for me, the program was all about the people. So my dearest friends, the experience was second to none. I mean, it was truly life-changing. And I'm not just saying that because you're sitting in front of me and I sing Wharton's praises all the time because it was everything to me. And it made me a better professional in a lot of ways. Actually, it made me far more confident and just really helped me navigate life in ways that I never expected. I've made very sort of big decisions after that program. And I don't know if I would have ever had the courage, nor the insight, nor the opportunity to do so had I not been through the program.
It's amazing to hear. Thank you so much for kind of giving your perspective. And I have to say that the people is the number one answer whenever we ask alumni, what was the most impactful part of this program? It's, it's always their classmates first, and then it's, the curriculum and the faculty and all these other things. But it's the connections that you make when you're in the program. You forge these really strong bonds because you're together, separate from your family, separate from work, and you're really all together, coming together for the same purpose. So that's fantastic.
And you're taken care of, by the way. So I'm like, oh, I can't just get my books given to me after this. Like it was, it's sort of this concierge level service.
Right.
So Wharton does everything it can while you're in the program, the member program, to not actually feel the pressure of anything else while you're there, but you're so focused on the academic side and really sort of inherently creating these relationships that in some ways that burden is lifted off of you and allows you to really focus. And I think that was really, it was so helpful. And you almost don't realize how lucky you really are until it's all over. You're like, wow, they just made it so easy for me. So it was, yeah, like I said, I can't say enough about the program.
Thank you. I'm sure our class managers will love to hear that. They are incredible. They're the people who book your hotel reservations for you every other weekend and figure out all of your books and supplies. And yeah, they do a lot. So I'm happy to hear that you found that beneficial as well. Mori, thank you so much for talking to us about this really important topic. It was a pleasure getting to meet you and getting to know you. And I did see that we've got some questions coming in.
Yes, yeah. So we'll do some Q&A from the audience. I am going to share just a quick slide that has Mori's contact information and where you can follow her on Instagram and things like that. So let me put that up very quickly here while we do our Q&A. Okay, so yes, use the Q&A feature if you have a question, but we've got a few in here. So one of our questions is about kind of traditional power dynamics in negotiations and how to maybe handle that. This person specifically asks about negotiating with older men in the workplace, but I think, there's so many different power dynamics that could be encompassed in this question. So how do you draw boundaries? How do you maintain firm communication? How do you ensure that you're not getting lost? So I'd love to hear your answer to that question.
So I work in the sports industry, so that's probably about as male dominated of an industry that you can get. So none of what I will share is at all naive, but I know how challenging it is, right? And even sort of the age dynamic added on top of that, right? But here's the thing is that, I didn't talk about this earlier, but negotiations has various stages, right? And there's sort of that preparation phase that comes before. And then there's this other sort of stage where you're first meeting with people, right? This is where connections are built. This is where you build rapport. This is well before the transactional sort of negotiations itself, which is when somebody makes an opening offer or whatever the actual transaction is. But that stage in between preparation and the actual transaction is what we call information exchange. And that the importance of this stage is, again, this is where you're sort of laying down this foundation that allows us to connect with people well beyond anything that's transactional, because those things are usually just very black and white. This creates these like beautiful shades of gray, right? You get to know what's important to somebody. You allow them to understand that you're really interested in them. This is not about just an outcome. This is a process that you're committed to. And why I'm saying this is so important, I mean, it's to me, it's as important as preparation, and somehow maybe even more important in some ways, because it actually adds to the preparation, right? You just don't know anybody until you actually meet them, no matter what you've studied, right? Because that sort of face-to-face interaction allows you to use your emotional intelligence to get a feel for their personalities, quirks, whatever it is. But why that particular stage is so important, and particularly male dominated, particularly where these sort of power dynamics exist, is that everybody likes talking about themselves. Men really like talking about themselves, right? So if you give them that opportunity and you're asking them questions about, maybe their kids, maybe their life outside of the work, who they are, right? They're well beyond executives and whatever decision makers they are in this company. We have multiple sides to us. And what I've found is that when we sort of focus in on this individual or individuals in a way that says, yeah, we'll get to that part of the conversation later. And let's say there's a picture of their kids in the background and you start asking them about their families. Everything changes so dramatically because for that moment, they become very human. And there's sort of the softening of the edges. And I can't tell you when that hasn't worked, because I've seen it work every single time. And you allow people that space to talk about themselves. It sort of takes them by surprise because they're not really expecting that. They're expecting you to come in and just really sort of deal with what's the business at hand. And then there's sort of this sense of pride and allowing them to sort of soften up a little bit. Takes them by surprise, allows for greater connection. And somehow I feel like those really rough edges kind of go away. And will it change things like, the sexism and whatever sort of biases they came in with? Maybe, maybe not, but it gave you greater insight to them. So now you can better understand things like intentions, right? That if this person is, much, much older, they are a product of not the 80s, but the 50s, what is appropriate to them is probably really different than what's appropriate to us right now, right? So you start contextualizing some of those things and maybe not taking some things really personally, but because you have greater insight into this individual. So I highly suggest that you sort of make that a greater focus of this process before you move on to the business at hand. Always show up being prepared, always show up being confident. There's nothing, I think, better than to lead with your confidence and your preparation and your knowledge, but then allowing the humanity into the conversation, I think really helps.
Great. Thank you. I love that humanizing piece. I think that's just such a different way of looking at it, and I think it's so important. So we've got a few more questions in here. So for people who maybe you're talking to who don't want to do the inner work and are more looking for like the quick tricks of negotiation, maybe they're afraid of looking inward, whatever it might be. How do you deal with that, and how do you convince people that this inner work is necessary if they want to be a good negotiator?
They're going to have a really hard time in my class. We spent really 4.5 months basically digging in, and I think vulnerability is really scary for a lot of people. And I can't just come out of the gate and say, look inward, right? This is the issue, because people don't make that natural connection. So the onus is on me to really show them how these things are so connected, and that, if you don't better understand yourself, then how will you ever really know what's truly important to you, right? How will you ever really be happy with the decisions that you make, or even the negotiations that you have, right? Because if it's always in search of more or winning, sometimes more isn't better. Sometimes winning is at the expense of other people. And so I think that journey is so necessary. And I think where people really sort of change their attitude is that, I'm not saying this is important and be vulnerable and that's going to make them weaker. They understand that by having greater clarity, that this can actually lead to their success, right? How goal setting is so relevant to your outcomes, right? The studies that I sort of quote, and it's really, I mean, it's striking, right? When I tell them that, all these studies, whether it's in positive psychology, again, athletic performance, negotiations, the studies tell us that people who are more aspirational and they set aspirational goals actually do better in negotiations than those people who don't. And so how do we do our goal setting? Again, it comes from a place of knowing what you're worth and the deservedness conversation, right? So when I start making those connections and back it up with sort of the research that we have, maybe at the beginning it's difficult, but then they slowly understand why what they've never been asked to do before in a negotiations class or a book is so much more important to them. And so they start sort of opening up, and it's a hard process for a lot of people. It's not easy. When you peel back the onion, it is scary sometimes, but when they see the payback and how it really changes everything from personal relationships to outcomes and negotiations, then I've sort of gotten them hook, line, and sinker, because now they know that that's what this is all about. It's not memorizing tactics and strategy. Again, I could do that all day long. It is easy. What's not easy is this other piece of it that's so relevant.
So true. So true. I'm glad to hear that usually people do come around for you doing this work with them.
Always.
So I love this question. Imagine that you are in the middle of a negotiation and you realize that you are kind of feeling that imposter syndrome, feeling the insecurities, the people pleasing. How do you recover in the moment? Is that possible? What do you say or do in that moment? How do you kind of reset yourself if you're right in the middle of it?
Take a break, right? And some people are actually really good at, again, the mindfulness, right? Bringing themselves back to that moment, sort of pressing reset. they can sit there and do it. I'm an emotional person. So if part of this is, I'm getting angry, or I'm getting defensive, or I'm thinking, oh my God, what am I doing? I'm selling myself short. Um, I'm not saying the right things. I'm not really leaning into sort of the goals that I've set. I'm sort of negotiating with myself. You take a break. I have to get up and walk away. And so whether it's taking I have to go to the restroom, or what, make a phone call, whatever it is, everybody sort of is entitled to that moment. And there's nothing better than allowing yourself to sort of come back into your body, right? When our emotions get ahead of us, it's when we can't think logically and critically, then we make really bad decisions. And so give yourself that, right? Breathing. I mean, this all sounds really easy, but breathing is so incredibly important that if you just take a minute, right, and say, stop. Like, you don't, just because they want to sort of run into this conversation, it doesn't mean I have to follow. It means that, I can set the pace. And that is actually the first negotiations that you have, right? It's the one that says, what do I need right now? I'm not at my best right now. I need to sort of pull back for a moment. Maybe I'm getting defensive for no reason, maybe whatever it is, but taking that break, breathing, resetting is the best way to do it, because I almost think a lot of people think if you walk away, it makes you seem not so confident and, oh, they need a break. I almost think you look more confident because you're creating the rules, right? You're setting the pace. You're saying, I need a moment, and you're just getting up and going, away for a few minutes and coming back. And now maybe you're a different person. Now maybe you have more control of your emotions. Maybe that you can think better and more critically at that point. But it's absolutely possible. You want to do it well before you start actually giving away too much, right? Because once you've sort of put a lot of those things out there, then it becomes really detrimental, and some of those things are harder to fix. So it goes back to the notion of, why do you have to be present? Why do you have to be mindful? You have to know that this is happening to be able to take corrective action.
Yes. Thank you so much. I like that idea of both a physical and a mental reset. I really like that. I think we have time for maybe one more audience question. So this person is wondering, obviously your own book, but do you have any other advice or things where you would recommend people practice doing this, in particular around articulation, speaking skills, how to succinctly articulate your ideas, anything around, any resources around that, or just practical things, ways they can practice?
Yeah, there's sort of a lot out there. The nice thing is that there's resources for all these things now. I definitely recommend people sort of learn more about and read more about things like mindfulness, and it's sort of how important it is in business decision making anyway, because then you can also see some of the research around it. It becomes more than just a nice to have, and maybe some of the tricks that will allow you to do so better, whether it's how you set boundaries, how you set personal boundaries, and all of that. Then there's sort of a lot of work around the power of presence, and how you actually show up is so important, right? Research tells us that leverage actually is directly correlated to perception and how people perceive you. So, how you show up, how you speak, how you present, all those things are really, really important, because it's that which people hear that I always think is more important than that which you say, right? So how you deliver these things are really, really important. And there's Amy Cuddy, who's probably the leading expert around this work, and she's done probably one of the best TED Talks out there. Again, understanding what presence is and what it means and how it's important in communication is really important. Learn to listen better. There's a lot of really great books, actually, especially now post-pandemic, because people somehow lost that ability. And I don't really know if it was because everybody's at home screaming at each other or what it is, but there's so much more research around why listening well is so difficult to achieve, particularly again with the distractibility and all that, and why it's so important. It's not just what we say in communications that's important, it's really the whole power of listening, and even the power of silence to sort of learn and become more informed throughout this process. So I would encourage people to do that, and don't take that for granted. Don't think it's an easy thing to achieve. It's really not. What else can I tell you? Brene Brown, I don't know what to say. That's sort of a hard stop. all her work is so focused on, again, this notion of what we deserve. And she's done a lot of work on shame and guilt, but really at the core of her work is really the courage to be completely yourself, and the authenticity that's involved in that, and how that leads to better business decisions, how that leads to a better life. So just again, just knowing who she is and the work that she's done, her TED Talks, her podcasts, she's incredible. I would highly recommend for those who have not been followers of to do so. And between her and Amy Cuddy, that's probably a sort of a magnificent duo. Lastly, and this may come as a surprise to people, but the 5 love languages. It's a book that people think is like all about just relationships. I actually think it's one of the best negotiations books out there, because it really talks about how people receive love so differently, but that also translates how we hear things differently. We receive things differently based on our life experiences. And it's really important for us to be reminded of that when there's communications gaps, it's not because what you're saying doesn't work. It's just that the delta between what you're saying and what they're hearing is so big that it doesn't allow for better communications and for your intention really to come through. So I don't know, I think those are some of the resources that people I probably don't necessarily expect as far as negotiations go, but I think they're at the core of successful negotiations.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing those resources and those ideas for ways that people can kind of become better at this stuff. So that is all the time that we have for Q&A from the audience today. Mori, thank you so much for fielding those audience questions. That was much appreciated. Kendra, I am actually going to turn it back over to you here for a moment.
Sure. Yeah. And thank you so much, Mori, for presenting on this really important topic. Thanks for the great questions from the audience. Really good, thought-provoking questions. It's always great to see. And I wanted to let you all know that we're available at the Wharton School. If you are thinking about going back and getting your MBA, if you're considering the executive program, please go ahead and schedule a conversation with us. So we offer one-on-one Zoom calls similar to this. And there's a QR code on this slide if you wanted to take a photo of it. There's a link in the chat box as well, but you can feel free to schedule a conversation with us. We're happy to answer any questions that you have. It's nothing formal. It's just a casual 15-minute chat about the program. We can review your resume if you'd like to upload that and take a look and just kind of give you some feedback about, if you're a good candidate for the program and what your next steps may be. And if you are interested in applying, our program begins every year in May. The last week of May is our intake, and our round 2 deadline is January 18th. And that's our final deadline. So if you are interested in applying for this round, make sure you schedule a convo so that we can get your application ready for submission. All right, so we're always happy to chat with you. And thank you so much for coming out today and supporting Forte. And it was great meeting you all.
Thank you.
Great. Well, Mori and Kendra, thank you so much for your insights today. Conversations around this topic are so important, and we appreciate you sharing your expertise, Mori. Recordings of this webinar and all of our webinars can be found on our website. It's fortefoundation.org. It's also on the slide here. And we thank all of our audience members for attending today. We hope you enjoyed the webinar, and thank you for completing the evaluation that you'll receive as well. We look forward to having you join again for future Women Lead webinars, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you.